I've lived and worked here in Portland, Maine, and every spring we get biblical levels of rain. It's a huge pain in the butt, but it's something you just learn to live with after a while. You invest in a good umbrella and a waterproof coat and just muddle on like a good Mainer does. Although if some of you Californians saw the kind of weather we endure, you'd be more than likely to call us maniacs as opposed to Mainers. As I said, for the most part, the rain is nothing but a minor irritation, a price we pay for the magnificent falls that are enjoyed by leaf peepers from all over the country. But as I found out one dark and rainy night, the climate in this area of the country can sometimes make it straight up dangerous to live here. So picture the scene. It's raining cats and dogs. I'm walking back to the apartment in an older part of town, and it's full dark. One of the streets on my regular route has been around since the early 1800s and is still lined with cobblestones, while the sidewalks are these big, flat, slate-like slabs that can get super slippery in the spring and fall. I'm pretty sure it's because of a special kind of algae or moss that grows on them, making them really slimy, but I'm not a biologist, so don't quote me on that. All I know is it can be like a freaking ice rink at certain times of the year, but on one occasion it was more of a death trap than an ice rink. I'd already gotten an idea of how slippery it was as I was walking, but as I got a text that I assumed was from my boss, hopefully regarding the raise I've been probing for, the light from my phone must have thrown my vision off and, in turn, my footing. Because one minute I'm just walking along minding my own business, and then next, I'm lying on the sidewalk with the wind knocked out of me, as the ground beneath me just up and disappeared or something. The first thought that registers through my brain is all sorts of expletives that I can't repeat here, and as I try to find my feet again. Only I can't. My left foot just doesn't seem to do what I want it to, and when I look, it's flopping around in this way that makes my stomach churn. That's when the pain starts to throb through my leg, and in seconds, it's like my entire body is just racked with agony. Every time I move, this shooting pain just zaps up my calf and thigh, and I begin to realize I've suffered either a serious break or a very serious sprain. Any other time, I'd have just called 911 there and then, but my phone must have slipped out of my hands as I fell, and when I looked around for it, it was nowhere to be seen. I started thinking it might have slipped off the sidewalk or something, but right as I'm about to look, something else grabs my attention. A sewer drain, just off the sidewalk. One of those metal grid kinds, not a culvert, and it hits me that my phone might have actually clattered down into the sewer as I fell. It was a horrendous stroke of misfortune, but I figured it couldn't be long until a passerby stumbled across me so I could get the help I needed. But as I'm looking around, getting increasingly soaked by the relentless New England deluge, I realize there's not a soul on the streets. You get accustomed to Maine rain, that's a given, but you still avoid going out in the worst of it. It occurs to me that if I'm actually wanting any help, I might actually have to call out for it, or even scream for it. So there I was, forced to actually scream for help, and as weird and prudish as it sounds, I don't know what was worse, the pain, or the sheer embarrassment that I'd fallen and couldn't get up. I give 3 solid blasts of "Can anyone hear me? Help, I'm hurt real bad," but no one seems to respond. Like I can see lights on in windows of apartment buildings mere yards away, so I knew well people could hear me. They just chose not to help. It was pretty crushing thinking that people actually knew I was there, but didn't lift a freaking finger to help. But I guess that's life in big cities these days. People are terrible. Assume everything is fake or a scam or whatever. It is what it is. Anyways, a few minutes go by and it slowly becomes apparent that no one is coming to help, and that if I want to actually make any progress in getting to the emergency room, I might actually have to drag myself along the wet sidewalk until I find someone compassionate enough to actually help me. But just before I'm forced to undergo such an indignity, I suddenly see the silhouette of a person appear in a streetlight, and I start calling out to my shadowy potential savior. Now, you'd think if you saw a girl lying in the street calling out for help with obvious pain in her voice, you'd at least change your pace to get over to her a little faster. But this guy seems to notice me, stop for a second, and then just carried on walking over to me at the same speed, without saying a word. It was a weird feeling having that overwhelming relief turn into absolute dread in just a few moments. The person approaching me wasn't giving off any of the compassionate, helpful vibes that I expected. In fact, they were giving off quite the opposite. They didn't say a thing in response when I was all like, Sir, I think I've broken my ankle. Can you please call 911? Just stayed completely silent. Seconds later, I'm looking up at this guy, rain splashing my eyes, and with his hood up I can barely make out any of his facial features. What happened to you? He asked, seemingly barely concerned at all. It was also like he hadn't been paying any attention at all when I actually told him what the issue was. Like, at the risk of sounding ungrateful, I totally spelled it out for this guy, and to have him reply with, "Huh, what?" was as frustrating as it was unnerving. I tell him all over again, but skip the backstory in favor of just begging him to call 911. He barely moves, or rather, he made 0 attempts to get his cell phone out to make the call. Instead, he just towers over me, silently staring at me like I was some kind of animal curiosity. I dropped my phone. Can you see it anywhere? I remember asking him. At that moment, he did actually start looking around for it, which momentarily restored a little of my hope that he actually wanted to help. But in hindsight, I don't think he'd have handed it over if he'd found it. Because his next move, one which I mistook for him trying to help me up, was to basically start patting me down for valuables before he just went and grabbed my purse off me. I was stunned to silence as he rifled through its contents, helping himself to a few loose bills. I couldn't believe anyone could be so callous, even in a big city like Portland. I was disappointed, angry, and in pain, but I wasn't outright scared until the guy took out my photo ID that I use for work, stared at it for a moment, and then slid it into his pocket. Because that's when I realized that he wasn't doing this just for monetary gain. He wasn't so much of a thief or an opportunist as he was an outright predator. And the thought of what he was going to do next completely terrified me. He didn't walk away with the money and my ID. He just carried on standing over me, staring, probably delighted at how helpless I was, how he could do whatever he liked to me, and there wasn't a soul around to stop him. A 38-year-old woman, and I felt like crying, like a little girl. I begged him not to hurt me, to just leave with the money he'd taken. I think he just got off on that, but what else was there to do? I was in no position to fight back. Best I could hope for was to hit him with my keys if he tried to, take things further. Then right as I'm reaching for them, lying there, discarded on the sidewalk, I hear one of the sweetest sounds I'd ever heard in my life.
Excuse me, is everything all right?
It was a guy's voice, polite but aggressive, accusatory. Someone had finally emerged from one of the nearby apartment buildings, and at that, the hooded guy starts walking off, just as chill as ever.
Hey, I'm talking to you.
The guy says before looking back at me, then calling back inside for, I'm guessing, his wife and someone to call the cops. He then rushes out to ask if I'm okay, which triggers the biggest wave of ugly crying as I just point to my messed up ankle in between shakes of my head. Cut to a few hours later, I'm laid up in the hospital with a broken ankle, high as a kite on the best stuff the Blue Cross can buy. I gave a statement to the cops, had a little cry with my mom when she came to visit, then went about informing all my coworkers that I wouldn't be seeing them for a few months. I got some small amount of closure when I heard the guy was arrested for petty theft. Apparently he had a history of drug addiction and mental illness, and had committed a handful of opportunistic robberies over the last few years. As a result, this last strike was going to send him back to jail for a few years. Something I take a great deal of comfort in. I'm an 80s girl, not like some millennial who just likes the aesthetic. No, I literally grew up in the 80s, the time before cell phones, internet, satellite TV, when the only things you could get delivered to your door was milk or pizza. It does seem kind of surreal thinking about it now, just how slowly things changed over the years and let me tell you, boy do I wish we had some of the things we have now back when I was a teenager. It sure would have saved me a lot of trouble from time to time, and this story is one of them. Until I'd saved up enough money for my own car, I'd have to walk to and from work whenever I couldn't wrangle myself up a ride, and that turned out to be most days. Then, this one night, I'm 18 and I'm making the regular walk back to my parents' house when the heavens decide to open up on me. Out of absolutely nowhere, too. Pure Noah's Ark levels of rain that had me running for cover. I mean, don't get me wrong, some rain I'm good to walk in, but this was like I'm gonna drown levels of rain, so I thought it better to just take shelter and let it subside a little. But it didn't. At all. If anything, it just got more intense. So when this older guy pulled up alongside me in his car to offer me a ride, God knows how he spotted me, I just jumped in at the chance. I mean, I saw what was quite obviously a Bible just sitting there on the dash, and I bet anyone who would have done exactly the same as me and accepted the ride without so much as a second thought. But it didn't take long for me to realize I'd made a very, very bad decision. So I go to open the passenger side door to the guy's car. The handle creaks and groans but doesn't respond right away. This prompts the guy to open up his own door, which seemed to open the first time, to tell me that he's been having problems with her for years and that I needed to really pull. I do, and give the thing a good yank, hearing a metallic screech as the door finally opens up so I can climb inside and out of the rain. He apologizes and tells me the door's a real son of a gun, how it doesn't often open from the inside and that the window won't roll down either. He literally tells me this when it's too late to do anything about it, and although I'm not nearly ready to freak out or whatever, the fact that I'm technically trapped definitely made me feel less than comfortable. But still, he politely asks me where I'm headed before we make a little small talk about how the rain hadn't been this bad in years. After a while, he began complimenting my uniform, my hair, and told me I looked like his late wife, and that her spirit must have led him to help get me home. Sure, that's one heck of a red flag right there, but at the time, I don't know, it just came across as sweet as all, like a lonely older guy who pined for his late wife, and you can see where I'm coming from, right? Anyway, talk then moved to if I was still in school, what my hobbies were, and gradually turned to whether or not I was on my period. Don't ask me how. I have no idea how the conversation got to that point, but he wasn't weird about it, and it still seemed natural. I know that sounds crazy, but trust me. It's like he was about to make a joke or something, and it was about as wholesome as period conversations got, and the way he talked was like parental, if that makes sense. Needless to say, I didn't freak until he said very calmly, "Because once you've blossomed into a woman, you should start a family as soon as you're able." As I'm registering what he'd said, he goes on to tell me that he believed that God's plan was to keep him lonely for years, like a test or something. But now, because I looked so much like his late wife, it was clear I was meant to be his, so he could start life over again and finally have lots of children like his wife was unable to. Then, as I'm staring straight ahead, just feeling my stomach slowly tying itself into knots, he takes my hand, kisses it, and says something like, "It's gonna be magical, taking you to bed again." Like many girls before me, and doubtless many girls to come, I was faced with the unenviable task of keeping calm enough to keep my captor chill, while coming up with a plan to get out of there safely. And let me tell you, that's not easy to do when all your brain is saying is panic, panic, panic. My first line of defense was feigning surprise, like, "Oh dang, I forgot to clock out of work. Well shucks, looks like I'm gonna have to get out of here and walk back." But he responds by telling me it could wait until tomorrow. My second line of defense is telling them that I had to pee real bad, and that it's harder to hold when it's that time of the month. I think I was trying to appeal to that parental side that I thought I saw. Turns out that was my second serious mistake. He told me I could hold it until we get home. Only the way he said it, he didn't sound so sweet anymore. The words we and home cut like a knife, and with that, it became obvious that he had absolutely no intention of letting me out of the car. I'm as quiet as a mouse by this point. I have never felt that kind of fear before, so I'm half catatonic as he carries on jabbering away about how our lives are gonna be. I can actually feel my skin crawl as he tells me that he'll have to teach me to do things his way, how girls these days don't know how to act. According to him, the husband was boss, and what he said goes, while the wife's job is to simply submit and obey. It's all right there in the good book, he declared at one point, and twice jabbed a finger into the leather binding on the dash. That's when this idea just burst into life in my head, one that took me all the way back to the handful of Sunday school lessons I had as a kid. If this guy wanted to marry me, he needed my father's permission, otherwise our marriage bed wouldn't be holy, or something like that. I mean, I knew that for a fact, so I innocently made the point as non-confrontationally as I could, and from the period of silence that followed, I knew I'd struck a nerve. When he finally spoke again, he talked down to me, saying he knew the Bible much better than I did, and that obviously he was going to ask for my father's permission. Then, we got to the street where I had previously told him I lived. He asked which house was my parents'. I gave him a fake house number, far away from mine, and had him drop me off there. He wanted to come inside. I told him I needed to let my parents know that God had sent me a husband. He couldn't just walk up in there uninvited if he wanted my dad to say yes to the whole thing. I said it might take a few days to convince them, and that he should come back tomorrow. He responds with, "I'll give you a few minutes, but we need to be on our way." I told him to drive around the block so I could have time to pack my clothes. He nodded and finally opened the car door. I ran to that house's door, waved to him until we drove away, then sprinted to my actual house where I told my parents everything. The cops were called and we watched as they showed up and talked to the guy before they just let him go. I was furious, but apparently he just told them that he'd given me a ride home and had no idea what I was talking about when it came to all the kidnap and marriage stuff. We were assured that his details had been taken and that if he tried anything else, he'd be easy to get in touch with. But if there was actually a next time, it might not just be him they have to find. It might have been my body, too. Thankfully, I never saw him again, but in the future, I insisted on waiting at work until my boyfriend could pick me up. Failing that, I'd just cough up the money for a cab, even if it did cut into my tips. I mean, there'd be no spending that cash if I was locked in some fundamentalist basement, right? The point is that be careful whose car you're getting into, girls. Because you really never know who's actually sitting behind that wheel. And the people who came across as the kindest can sometimes be anything but. In December of last year, I realized that because of a promotion I'd received during the summer, I was able to afford a new apartment. My old apartment had a bunch of chronic problems with it, and half of them were the kind of thing that I might have picked up on should I have given it a proper inspection beforehand. So when it came to shopping around for a new place, I was beyond thorough when it came to the kind of research I put in. After I admitted to asking an estate agent how thick the apartment door was, a friend of mine would kind of get on my case and say no landlord is ever going to offer you a tenancy. And in a way, he was right. But I found my approach only put off the dodgy landlords, while the decent ones completely understood why I was asking so many questions. Which is why when I actually found somewhere I liked, it made the experience way more stressful than exciting. I was competing with over 100 other applicants for the tenancy. It has these huge western-facing windows, on the second floor too, meaning you get some incredible sunsets along with great spots for houseplants. And the shower. My God, the shower. Built-in waterproof Bluetooth speakers, steam jets, UV lights to stop bacteria from growing anywhere. Okay, I'll quit flexing about my shower. And spoilers, I got the flat, but it's not like it gives me much joy anymore anyway. None of those amenities do anymore. and the only thing I find myself paying any serious attention to is the living room ceiling. Weird picture, isn't it? A guy just sitting there, drinking coffee, eating dinner, eyes glued to the blank white plaster above him. But I catch myself doing it an awful lot, a disturbing amount actually, and now I'll tell you why. Like I said, everything about this flat seemed perfect, and for the most part it was. But literally 8 days after I move in, right while I'm still quietly confident that everything was in working order, stuff hits the fan. I'm sitting on the couch, watching TV, and the rain is just pelting against the windows. This horrible, cold December rain, the kind that makes it a kind of thrill hearing pattering against the glass. So I'm just chilling when I hear this tapping sound coming from down the hallway. I don't really think anything of it at first, like it honestly sounded like someone in the hallway outside the flat. But after a while, I decide to investigate because the sound just isn't ceasing. As I walk into the hall, I can tell almost right away that the tapping sound is coming from my bathroom. And when I open up the door, I'm faced with this steady leak coming from the air vent in the ceiling. Just 8 days in, 8 freaking days, and I have a leak. Yeah, it's only a minor one, but as anyone who's dealt with leaking pipes or dodgy plumbing might tell you, even the smallest amount of water can be absolutely catastrophic if a leak isn't dealt with right away. The water might pool somewhere out of reach, rotting wood and causing that disgusting stagnant water smell. It can be a massive pain. So, I'm kind of panicking, looking up the names of local plumbers, cursing the landlady's name all the while for not telling me if there were leaky pipes. It had been raining all day, so it could have easily been something to do with all the rain. But I had an entire 3rd floor above me. How was the roof drainage merging with the vents? And that's when I had my big brain, or not so big brain moment, and realized that it might well be coming from the flat upstairs. Maybe they'd left the bath running or something. I remember thinking it was annoying, but accidents happen. I run upstairs, knock on the door of the unit directly above me, but get no answer. Then, making sure no one's around to watch me, I kneel down and put my ear to the keyhole. Innocently enough, but try explaining that to some stranger with no context. I expected to maybe hear some running water, maybe even the sound of someone mopping up the overflowed bathwater. But nothing. It's just silence on the other side. Given that I can hardly go kicking the door in, I just go back to my flat, whack a mop bucket under the leak, then get on the phone with the landlady, in case she had a plumber on retainer or something. Being the nice lady that she is, my landlady calls me back within minutes to let me know a plumber is on his way. But given that he was already at a job, I'd have to wait about an hour. No big drama. It was a manageable leak, for the time being anyway, but we'd still have to gain entry into the flat upstairs to make sure if it was the source of the whole thing. So, I take it upon myself to walk back upstairs every so often to check if someone had returned home. At least I presume they were out. There was no other reason why they wouldn't just answer the door, right? I checked the first time, then the second was maybe 15 minutes later, then the third was just shy of 9 at night, like 20:57 on the dot. I remember because it was 15 minutes before the plumber was due to arrive, and I'd checked the clock just before making one final trip upstairs to check if the neighbors were home. Only when I get to the front door of their flat, which I'm 100% certain had been closed for the previous 2 calls, I can see that it's ever so slightly ajar. I'm certain someone is home by that point, so out of pure politeness, I give the door a few loud knocks before shouting like, "Hello?" expecting someone to appear any second. But again, there's no reply. But that time I can definitely hear the sound of dripping water inside the apartment. So, I go ahead and push the door open, seeing that almost the entire carpet is soaking wet. The flat is laid out exactly like mine is, so I know the first room I'm going to encounter is the bathroom. The linoleum floor is flooded, the sink is flooded, but the taps are off. There's just a steady drip, drip, drip from one of them like it hadn't been turned off all the way. Again, I call out to see if anyone's home, kind of worried I might be seen as rude for just sort of barging in. Yet I'm greeted by complete silence. Just the sound of my own trainers squishing on the sodden carpet as I'm walking through the flat. If you're imagining this as being somewhat of a creepy scene, you'd be dead right. The closer I got to that living room, the more I realized that something might be terribly wrong here. And what do you know? There was. I think I knew she was dead from the moment I laid eyes on her. It was the awkward way she was lying there on the soaking wet floor with her eyelids kind of half closed. It's hard to describe, but I've never seen a person look like that. Like she was frozen in mid-blink or something. I just knew, you know? Like the gut reaction was so intense that I simply didn't need to check the girl's pulse. I didn't need to call out for her to wake up. I mean, I did, just in case. Part of that gut reaction to death was wanting her to wake up, for purely selfish reasons too, so I'd stop freaking out. But it was no good. She was gone. After I called 999, I tried some CPR and chest compressions as best as I could manage, but nothing would rouse her. It was the single most traumatic experience of my life, splashing around in the half-flooded flat, begging that poor girl to wake up, all before the moment I finally just sat on my butt and accepted that she was dead, and there was nothing more I could do. I never cried like that before. I'm not ashamed to admit it, and I stayed sat there like that until I saw blue flashing lights in the window. At first, the police were brilliant. They came in my flat with me, made a note of the leak telling me it was going to be okay and that I did everything right. I just sat there, nursing a cup of tea and telling them everything exactly as it happened. I remember touching on the whole fact that the doors seemed to have spontaneously opened, meaning that at some point, in the time between 2035 and 2057, either the victim or her killer had opened the flat's door for whatever reason. The two policemen shot each other this look that I misinterpreted as like an oof moment. But in retrospect, I think that was a sign of things to come. They definitely started by treating me like I was the poor innocent member of the public who happened to have stumbled across the tragic death of a young woman. But it didn't take long before they changed their attitude entirely. I got a call from a policeman calling himself D.I. Walker, who politely invited me to the local police station for further questioning. He assured me I wasn't in any trouble. They just wanted to go over a few details with me in light of new evidence that had emerged. It was an informal chat. No need for a solicitor or anything serious like that. So me being an absolute tool, I volunteered to talk to two murder police in an interview room with no one else present. They kept up the good cop routine for a while, going over my statement with me while buttering me up for trying the CPR. But a distinct change of tone came when one of the CID blokes asked me if I'd ever been up to the girl's apartment before the night in question. I told them no, that I'd only been there for just over a week when the leak started, and as much as it makes me sound like a bit of a jerk, I'm just not the kind of guy to greet new neighbors with a freaking muffin basket or whatever. Then bizarrely, their follow-up question was if I knew anything about electricals, like if I've ever worked as an electrician or repaired appliances for a living. Again, I told them no, but it was my turn to ask a question. Mainly why they asked me such an unexpected question. That's when they hit me with the fact that I was basically their number one suspect, and the way the guy said it was honestly horrific. Look, mate, the thing is, we've come up against a bit of a brick wall here, and we're hoping you can help us out. He started off all friendly, like we were old pals or something. You've given a brilliant statement here, and we're really grateful for you going into such detail and giving up your spare time. There's just one big problem. You said you knocked on the flat about 3 times between 8 and 9 o'clock, one at about 20 till, and once just before 9. We got the time of death as being 8:45 at the very latest, so you saying that you didn't hear anything when you knocked the second time, well, something is going on in that flat that causes this girl's death. I find that very confusing, don't you? I remember every word that he said, and I knew it wasn't even meant to be accusatory, I don't think. Not overtly, anyway. But I knew what they were getting at. They had to eliminate me as a suspect, but unfortunately for me, that was much easier said than done. Because my fingerprints were everywhere, my clothing fibers were everywhere, and there wasn't a single witness of anyone else having visited that girl's flat that day. No one but me, by my own admission. It started to become obvious that the police actually had a suspect in mind, and it was me. Although I was never actually arrested in the weeks that followed, I had my flat searched twice, and police were almost constantly hanging around the building both flats were in. I noticed that they seemed to take particular interest in the building's wiring, and once or twice they seemed to be accompanied by some kind of tradesman, I'm guessing an electrician. And that's about the same time I pieced together that the police thought the girl had died in some kind of freak electrical accident. Maybe a current had run through the flooding and just zapped her right there. But wouldn't that mean that I'd get electrocuted too? But that's just it. Despite the police refusing to tell me much about the investigation, I'm pretty sure they theorized that I'd somehow killed the girl using a jolt of electricity, which in my book showed how stumped they were for a legit theory. Don't get me wrong, the prospect of being the main suspect in a murder, getting a wrongful conviction or something, that's a terrifying thing for sure. But like I mentioned, I was never arrested, and after a while the whole thing just went away. Naturally, I wanted to know everything the police knew concerning my neighbor's death, but after basically being accused of murder by them at one point, I wasn't all that keen on drawing any more attention to myself. What's clear is that I was just meters away from a murder I had no idea was happening, and that I'd only just missed whoever the killer was when they slipped out of the apartment and left the door open. But why would they leave the door open? They couldn't have known that there was a leak, so why not just close the door and rule out the possibility of someone stumbling across the murder scene? And what was the point of flooding the flat in the first place? It wasn't just the bathroom sink. The kitchen sink was overflowing too, but why? On top of all that, I don't get the whole electrocution angle either. It seems like such an elaborate way to kill someone, flooding the apartment and then running a strong enough current through the water, and how would a person go about doing that remotely? Because they'd have to, otherwise they'd be killed too. Which leads me back to the question of, who opened the door then? Was it some elaborate way of her taking her own life, and she wanted someone to find her before she went rotten? Too many questions. So, are you all starting to understand why I spend an awful lot of time just staring at my ceiling? How I can't seem to shake all the questions that have arisen since I moved in here? And what's worse, I'm kinda stuck here. Yeah, it's a nice place, but Jesus, it's tainted now. And it's going to take a long time before I'm going to feel normal again here. It's not like I have the money for a new deposit, and finding a place I actually like is tough going. And that's the gist of it, I suppose. I've been living under what feels like a tomb, and the mysteries of my neighbor's death have been keeping me up at night for freaking months now. I'd be very interested to hear other people's theories on this because, much like the police seem to be, I'm completely flummoxed as to what the explanation is. I mean, it's probably something perfectly rational, something tedious but tragic. But then again, sometimes my imagination starts taking over, and I start thinking that something entirely more sinister is to blame. For more than 100 years now, both Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts have sat around roaring log fires at night and carried on the rich tradition of telling campfire tales. For the most part, these stories have detailed the murderous exploits of all kinds of boogeymen, monsters, and cryptids. Yet some touch on another oft-told urban legend, that of the deranged psycho killer, the escaped asylum patient, hell-bent on the meaningless slaughter of innocents. However, as terrifying as these stories may be, we still use them for entertainment purely on the premise that they're completely fictional, that the monsters we're so afraid of can't really hurt us. There aren't any real psychopathic killers out there in the woods, are there? But maybe it'd be best to hear the story of the Oklahoma Girl Scout murders before we make any definitive judgment on that. Nestled into Mays County, Oklahoma, Camp Scott used to be one of the Sooner State's premier Girl Scout camps. It's also one of the oldest, with the year 1977 being the 50th anniversary of its founding. Camp Scott also happens to be located on 410 acres of the most beautiful land in the entire country, with the surrounding area comprised of gently sloping hills, Tolkien-esque forests, and a tranquil freshwater creek. Interspersed in the area are a series of platform tent clusters which host any visitors. For those who were never scouts as kids, a platform tent is a large canvas tent pitched semi-permanently on a raised wooden platform, sometimes with a tin roof or tarp on top. It can usually sleep 4 to 6 people and has zippers on both sides of the tent to close the inner flap, with ties to close the outer and side flaps. There is no way to 100% close the tent in a secure way, but it is generally sturdier of an option than tent camping on the ground, and platform tents are somewhere between a cabin and a tent in terms of comfort. Like many Girl Scout camps, the tents at Camp Scott were arranged in small campsites scattered throughout the camp, each with fire pits and related amenities, with each named after a Native American tribe. You could be forgiven for thinking the camp was an outdoor paradise, a serene, wholesome slice of Eden, brimming with innocence, far from the hustle and bustle of the big city. But just a short while before the camp season of 1977, a training session was held in which veteran camp counselors would coach the incoming counselors in training on what would be expected of them. One of these counselors picked up a box of donuts on the way over, finding that a sweet treat made for a great conversation starter among the new arrivals and generally made them feel more welcomed. She shared a few of the donuts among her fellow counselors, but left the remaining donuts back near the counselor campground when she took the new arrivals on a tour of the area. When she returned, the donuts were gone, and in their place was a filthy handwritten note that bore just 3 scrawled words: 3 will die. The girl immediately showed the note to one of the camp's head of operations, but instead of taking the threat seriously, they dismissed the note as nothing but a tasteless prank and instructed the counselors to go about their business as usual. On the first day of camp season, Girl Scouts from all 4 corners of Oklahoma were bussed into Camp Scott to begin the first of many week-long visits. The mood was generally high among the young women, as school had recently finished and that summer break elation was still very much at its peak. But that Sunday, June 12th, was hardly an ideal summer's day. Thick fogs and misty rains had turned the camp into a complete soaked mess. Yet the Girl Scouts' spirits weren't dampened, and they remained positive as they were split into groups and shown to their respective campgrounds. Thankfully, the weather relented enough for the girls to partake in a few camp activities before sundown. But as night fell, the rain resumed with a vengeance, and what had previously been a light smattering of drizzle turned into a full-on downpour. To keep from being soaked, the Girl Scouts rushed back to their platform tents to bed down early, confident that the weather would improve so they could return to their wholesome outdoor fun. The following morning, one of the counselors collected her wash kit and headed over to the camp's shower block. This shower block just so happened to be right at the rear of the camp near a collection of platform tents known as Kiowa, and thanks to the horseshoe arrangement of the platforms, one of them was ever so slightly obscured from view by the shower block itself. So at around 6 a.m. on the 13th of June, this counselor headed down the hillside to the trail which led to the bathhouse. But as she approached, she spotted 3 apparently occupied bags just lying there on the trail, sleeping bags that had been piled up against each other in a disturbingly unnatural way. There was no way there would be Girl Scouts in there. There was no way anyone could sleep like that. No one living, anyway. Because when the young counselor unzipped the sleeping bags to peek at what was inside, the entire camp was awoken by a blood-curdling scream. Inside the sleeping bags were 8-year-old Lori Lee Farmer, 9-year-old Michelle Heather Goose, and 10-year-old Doris Denise Miller. Each had their skulls bashed in by a large blunt object, with at least 2 of them showing signs of heavy strangulation. The camp was immediately evacuated while one of the camp's directors contacted the local police force. Sniffer dogs were brought in to search for clues, and a single unknown fingerprint was taken from one of the girls' flashlights, and a bloody-sized 9.5 footprint was found in the tent the girls were missing from. Shortly after the camp was closed off as a crime scene, Police interviewed a nearby homeowner who reportedly heard something rather heavy on the small road running between the camp and his property at around 3 a.m. on the morning of the 13th. Since all the counselors had solid alibis for the determined times of death, it was deduced that this must have been the killer moving to and from the area. After a large-scale manhunt was launched to flush out the murderer, local and federal law enforcement honed in on a man named Gene Leroy Hart. Hart already had multiple convictions for indecent assault, attempted murder, burglary, and escaping federal custody. And although he lived out near Tulsa at the time of the murders, it turned out that he grew up in a house less than a mile away from Camp Scott. It also turned out that Gene Leroy Hart was of Native American heritage, Cherokee to be exact, so police began to canvass the local charity community in hopes that they could assist them in tracking Hart down. Despite being somewhat distrustful of the visiting police officers, it said that once the local Cherokee learned that Hart was wanted in connection with the murder of 3 little girls, they fell over themselves to aid in the investigation. Eventually, a Cherokee man contacted the police by telephone, informing them of a rumor that Hart was sheltering in the isolated traditional home of a well-known medicine man. And although the place proved difficult to find, police found the tip to be a good one. Hart was arrested there and then, with the medicine man insisting he had no idea Hart was accused of such a heinous crime. According to him, Hart had merely confessed to doing something terrible, although he wouldn't specify exactly what it was. At his trial for the girls' murders, the local sheriff claimed that he was 1,000% sure that Hart was the guilty party. Yet despite the man's blind certainty, there was a number of holes in the prosecution's argument that were too significant to discount. The most pertinent being that Hart didn't wear a 9.5 size shoe, meaning it couldn't have been him that stepped in the girl's blood back at Camp Scott. The prosecution argued that a man could easily wear a size too small or too large and that the defense's argument was a flimsy one. However, when all the evidence was taken into consideration, the jury simply couldn't find Hart guilty beyond all reasonable doubt. Hart had a violent past, that much is clear, but to scapegoat him purely to sate rabid public demands for justice would be hideously unfair. Of course, there was a chance he was guilty. There was plenty of circumstantial evidence, but a man should only be locked in a cage for the rest of his life if the jury are, as the sheriff so clumsily put it, 1,000% certain. To their credit, the jury found Hart not guilty of the murders, and he walked away a free man. Yet this freedom was short-lived. After later violating his parole conditions, Hart was sent back to prison to finish his original 308-year prison sentence. You heard that right. The crimes that Hart had previously been convicted of were so utterly atrocious and prolific that a judge had seen fit to sentence him to more than 300 years in a federal penitentiary. He died of a heart attack in the prison exercise yard just 2 years later. But on the advent of DNA testing, police had the means to close the book on the Oklahoma Girl Scout murderers once and for all. When test results came back, police were stunned to discover that the chances of Hart being the girl's killer was almost 1 in 8,000. The victims' families have since demanded that more modern equipment be used in the hopes of getting more accurate readings, but law enforcement have insisted that the chances of an alternate result coming back are slim to none. As for the site of the murders, Camp Scott was never reopened to the public, becoming far too associated with a horrifying unsolved tragedy in which 3 young girls needlessly lost their lives. And without anyone convicted, there was no way anyone was going to send their kids to Camp Scott while the killer still stalked the area. These days, there's little left but forest where the camp once stood. Nothing to remind anyone of the 3 little girls who only ever wanted to have a fun summer at camp, but never returned home. For the longest time now, me and a mate of mine have been going hiking most weekends. It started out as quite a local affair, going to nearby forests or national parks, but we quickly wanted bigger and better challenges. So instead of just a few hours in the countryside, Our trips turned into entire weekends worth of hiking up mountains or across miles and miles of virgin forest. One time I made the huge mistake of getting drunk the night before and assuming that a country hike would be just what I needed to shake off the carling cobwebs. Boy, was I wrong. And by about mile 3 I have to stop just to puke my guts up of all the water I drank. I was in a bad way, but still I wasn't ready to turn back the way we came. Could be worse though, I remember my mate saying. It could be raining. And then literally, as he finishes talking, drip, 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 before you know it, full-on rainstorm, monsoon levels of rain just smashing down on us. We still had our sense of humor at that point, and I remember just bursting out laughing at what a ridiculous Hollywood moment that was. Like, you couldn't have timed it any better if you had a bloody sprinkler system close by. Anyway, we take a bit of shelter for a minute under this massive old pine tree, but it hardly does us any good. And on top of it all, it only slowed down a tiny bit, so we figured we were better just cracking on. After about a mile, we're getting increasingly soaked and increasingly miserable. Then just when I was about to propose throwing in the towel for some hair of the dog in a country pub, this massive fork of lightning streaks across the sky. I mean, it was massive too, like Thor himself was giving us our own personal pyro show. So we figured that if we find a little somewhere to hold up and stay semi-dry, we'd be able to watch the lightning for a bit before we call it a day. My mate points out this big old oak tree in the middle of a nearby field that looked like it'd be a great place to catch some cover. I agreed, so we started walking over to it. And here's where I have to admit to not being the most educated person around, and I don't reckon my mate will be too fussed if I call him a dense idiot for wanting to stand under this old single oak tree that stood out like a sore thumb, and you'll see what I mean in a minute. So as we're patting it towards the oak tree, the time between the flash and the bang of the thunder and lightning was getting shorter and shorter. We knew enough to know that this meant this storm was getting closer to us, or at least we were getting closer to the eye of it. But just how close? That we were about to find out. Because out of absolutely nowhere, the oak tree in front of us just explodes. Like it happened so fast that I didn't even really see the lightning hit the tree, just the shower of sparks and flame that flashed in the split second afterward. It was so awesomely frightening, and I mean that in the very sense of the word, that we were literally knocked off of our feet. Or rather, we stumbled back in the muddy field so fast with heavy packs on that we both just ended up on our butts shouting every swear word under the sun. Now you need to understand by that point, I'm just convinced my mate is cursed. The lad who made it rain with his powerful command of God's law, who made a tree explode just by saying, "Hey, that looks like a bonny wee spot there." But on a serious note, if we'd made it to that tree any earlier, we might have actually been killed. Not so much by the lightning, although third-degree burns doesn't sound too much of a laugh. But one of the massive branches fell off about a minute after the strike, and anyone under that would have been 100% crushed. If there was ever a sign saying we should just give up, it was that. So despite my mate being an absolute danger magnet, I took him to a pub and we calmed our nerves with a few neat whiskeys before hopping the train back. When I got home, the missus asked me how the hike was, and I tell her we nearly got struck by lightning. She replies, "Away on you bollocks," which is her native Norn iron for "Desist from such frivolous untruth, sir." I didn't mind. I just laughed, grateful to be home and in one piece. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release every Monday, Wednesday, Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And if you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit, r/Let'sReadOfficial, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations for just $1 a month on Patreon, and maybe even pick up some Let's Read merch on Spreadshirt. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all these stories in long compilation form and save huge on data. Located anywhere you listen to podcasts. Links in the bio. Thanks so much, friends. and I'll see you again soon.